Okay, so we're delighted to host this webinar or meeting so that Jakob and Molly can talk to you about the two writing workshops that they're going to be doing for people in November. Jakob came to me, what was just before Eating Disorders Awareness Week last year, yeah,
Mhm.
or last February, and told me about the research that he's doing and how interesting it is, and that also he has got funding to hold two writing workshops with Molly Twomey, who's going to be speaking to us today as well. So we're delighted to be able to host this and to be able to put Jakob and Molly in touch with people who are interested in taking part in this experience. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Jakob, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his work and about the writing workshops. So Jakob Summerer is a PhD researcher and lecturer at Trinity College Dublin. In his current research, which is funded by Research Ireland, he's exploring metaphor use in memoirs written by people with eating disorders. He's particularly passionate about bringing linguistics, the humanities, and the health sector into fruitful dialogue about the connections between well-being and language use. So, Jakob, I'm going to hand over to you if you want to share your slides and talk to us about what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Harriet. I will start sharing. Yes, hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jakob. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about my research. Thank you so much for having us, Harriet and Ellen. Just a quick sort of topic warning or topic announcement before we dive in. I just wanted to let you know that I'll be referencing memoirs written by people with eating disorders in my talk. There won't be any details regarding body weight or calorie intake or anything like that, but I will talk about some characteristic ways of thinking and feeling in people that have some issue with disordered eating. As Harriet already said, I'm here today to share some of my learnings from my PhD research with all of you, sort of in preparation for the writing workshop that Molly and I want to offer in November. Just to give you a bit of background for that, maybe. I am a linguist that researches the effects and functions of using metaphors in life writing, and I'm particularly interested in how metaphors and well-being might be connected. And in my research, or to explore these questions, I am looking at quite a large corpus of different eating disorder memoirs in different languages. I specifically focus on English and German. I've some of the memoirs that are in my corpus I have on my slide here. So these are autobiographies written by people about their lived experience of illnesses like anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder, for example. And when you read the introductions to a lot of these texts, you can kind of immediately gather that a lot of these books are intended to be acts of scriptotherapy. And what I mean by that is that the authors are writing or trying to write to the effect of improving their mental health and their well-being. At least they're trying to, they have that goal. And there is actually quite a lot of empirical evidence that attests to the effectiveness of writing in recovery from different health problems. Expressive writing can improve both the mental and the physical health of the writer, which I think is quite interesting. It has not only been linked to sort of a more psychological well-being or improvements in psychological well-being, it has also been linked to decreases in blood pressure, for example, and improvements in immune system functioning. So there is quite a substantial evidence that writing can, in fact, increase our well-being in various ways. And I'm personally quite interested in what exactly it is about writing that helps people in recovery. This is also a topic that many writers of eating disorder memoirs explicitly address themselves. For example, this writer I have on my slide here, or I'm quoting on my slide here, her name is Mara Schwarz. She's a German writer, and she says in her anorexia memoir, writing allowed me to verbally express what had been weighing on me for years, what I had tried in vain to starve away. So in her recovery, writing became this way of regulating her emotions. It became a way of finding some release from the pressures of some traumatic memories she had from childhood experiences. And it actually, in fact, came to replace her self-starvation behaviors as a soothing coping mechanism. So it kind of came to play that new role in her life, also under the influence of a therapist who gave her different writing exercises in therapy. And then she developed those writing exercises into a whole book. Another autobiographic writer, Stephanie Armstrong, says in her bulimia memoir, and I quote, "I found that by telling my most shameful secrets to young women still struggling with food, bulimia lost its power over me. Bringing my disease into the light relieved me of my shame instead of increasing it." So she experienced her writing as this sort of empowering form of self-disclosure. She feels like she's taking words into her own hands. She's deciding what to tell others about herself and her illness rather than leaving the talking to others. And that gave her quite a strong sense of agency and control as she started writing. And we can also see that narrating her illness experience rather than hiding it helped her to counteract the shame and stigma attached to bulimia and its symptoms. And we can also see that Armstrong is considering the audience of her memoir here. She's writing for or with the young women still struggling with food in mind. She repeatedly addresses this group throughout her memoir, and that is a feature that we see, in fact, in a lot of eating disorder memoirs. There's usually quite a lot of evidence that the writers are writing with this sort of imagined relationship in mind that they have with their audience, particularly their audience that might be struggling with similar issues around eating. And then writers usually set out to inspire and support those readers with eating problems by talking about their own recovery. So they're performing this role of a wounded healer, or what is sometimes called a wounded healer, of someone that uses their illness experience to help others. At the same time, so that is kind of one side of that imagined relationship with the reader. The other side of that is, especially in more recent memoirs, we can see that quite a lot of authors have a strong awareness that they are writing for vulnerable readers. They're writing for readers who might be negatively affected by reading about someone else's problems with eating. And that is a topic that is addressed in quite a lot of detail by Kelsey Osgood, who is a writer of an anorexia memoir. And in that memoir, she goes into quite a lot of detail and describes how inspired she was during the onset of her during the onset of her own anorexia by reading early eating disorder memoirs from the 90s. And those eating disorder memoirs from the 90s often tended to glamorize symptoms. That tended to provide way too much detail regarding body weight and calorie intake. And those then served as quite unhelpful points of comparison for Kelsey Osgood. She started comparing herself to the people in those books. She started copying their behaviors, and that then sort of had a strong and quite harmful influence on her own eating behaviors. In the introduction to her memoir, she writes, and I quote, "By withholding the salacious, the numbers essentially, I will attempt to show the bloody blue innards of the monster as opposed to its gleaming sharp fangs or elegant black cloak, to reveal it as messy and awkward and sad and pathetic, because I know now that the only way to understand anorexia, its magnetism on both a large and a small scale, and how to beat it, is to examine and then devalue its currency. It's to strip it bare of its beautiful language and its glamorous deathly aura." As we can see in this quote, Osgood is highlighting how important it is for an author to be conscious of the language that they use to describe their illness experience. She thinks writers of eating disorder memoirs should try to avoid the kind of language that we usually find in pro-anorexia and pro-bulimia communities, the kind of language that glamorizes and romanticizes eating disorder symptoms, that romanticizes emaciated bodies, acts of self-starvation, acts of purging, etc. She also argues that it's not just important to avoid certain ways of writing, but to actively engage in alternative, more helpful ways of writing. She models this in her own language use here when she describes anorexia as a messy and disgusting monster. What she's doing there, as you probably already noticed, is using a metaphor. She is understanding one thing, in this case anorexia, in terms of something else, in this case a monster, which then of course involves setting up an implicit comparison between these two phenomena. That means she's turning a very complex and very subjective illness experience into a more clearly delineated entity, into an entity that you can then step back from and reflect on, an entity that you can demystify and devalue. And she's doing this to sort of highlight the harmfulness and danger of this mental illness, I think. She attaches to it all the negative associations that we have with monsters. But I would also argue that at the same time, she's using a monster metaphor not just to highlight the negative aspects or the danger of an eating disorder. She's also using a monster metaphor to acknowledge that, like any kind of monstrosity, eating disorders can be fascinating and alluring, which is, of course, part of what makes them so dangerous. And this metaphor, she thinks, then helped her in her own recovery, or that's how she experienced it. Starting to talk about anorexia as a monster clearly framed her anorexic symptoms as a problem, and that helped her increase her illness insight and her motivation to engage in recovery and treatment. In my research, I have actually found that metaphors are often used in quite similar ways. They're often used with the potential to be helpful and healing in this way. I think metaphor is, in fact, one of those writing techniques that is particularly useful to anyone trying to improve their well-being through expressive writing, or really through any kind of creative activity. Because, of course, we have metaphors not just in written language, we also have metaphors in gesture, for example. We have metaphors in dance, in movement. We have metaphors in visual art. We have them in all kinds of creative activities. And in the second half of this presentation, I want to explore this connection between metaphor and well-being in a bit more detail, and just to give you a little insight into my research, discuss some techniques and some specific examples that I found in my corpus. For example, one of the sort of most important purposes, if you will, that I've seen metaphors serve in eating disordered memoirs is that they're often used for externalization. They're often used to externalize an illness. And what I mean by that is that writers are attempting to alienate and distance themselves from their illness. They're trying to position it as something that is not a part of themselves. And that is usually, or they usually find that particularly helpful as a first step in their recovery journey, quite early in their recovery. Osgood's monster metaphor that we just looked at is a good example of this kind of externalization. As some of you may know, many people with disordered eating often initially don't see their symptoms as dysfunctional. They often don't see their symptoms as problematic, which I think makes sense to some extent, because within our current culture, some of the behaviors that turn pathological in people with eating disorders are actually quite encouraged. So I think it makes sense that it takes a while for people to see their behavior as actually harmful rather than helpful. And that sort of problem with gaining insight into your illness then makes people feel ambivalent, and understandably so, about seeking and fully engaging with treatment. Some even come to understand their disorder or the behaviors that are associated with that as a cornerstone of their self, or as a positively valued personal and social identity. And then I think it makes a lot of sense that treatment is then perceived as an attack on the person's self, which of course significantly lowers treatment effectiveness and just in general like a willingness to engage in treatment. That is why many narrative therapists like Richard Maisel and his colleagues, whose book I have on my slide here, have started to encourage their clients to externalize their illness through the use of metaphor, to sort of work against this, seeing your illness as part of your identity, and to develop a metaphoric way of thinking about disorder that frames it as something that is alien and hostile to you as a person. And many writers in my corpus do this in highly creative ways, in fact. So, for example, in her anorexia memoir, Larissa Sarand writes, and I quote, "I once saw in a documentary that there's a parasite that invades the braids of snails, from where it causes them to position themselves prominently on a leaf in broad daylight, and thus to openly offer themselves up as bird food. Anorexia turned me into a snail." This externalizing metaphor shines a light on the otherness and harmfulness of anorexia. It transforms this illness into a brain-invading parasite that takes control of its host, and that forces its host to endanger her own life. And I think this metaphor quite strongly underlines the need for recovery, for getting rid of this foreign organism before it can cause the death of the person affected. And it frames anorexia as something that is impermanent, as a living organism with a limited lifespan that the person can in fact rid themselves of with the help of medical intervention and support, which then might inspire hope, or at least a belief in the possibility of change in the person using this metaphor. And it may also be helpful in recovery, I think, to understand the person affected by anorexia as a helpless host organism, an organism that is no longer in control of its own actions, because I think that highlights the person's lack of choice in developing their mental illness. So often people with disordered eating face the stigma that their illness is a lifestyle choice, something that they have only themselves to blame for. And positioning the person with anorexia as the host of a parasite counters this harmful prejudice, at least to some extent, I think, and combats self-blame, guilt, and shame. On a slightly related note, metaphors can also be used to frame and reframe aspects of someone's reality, specifically those aspects of someone's reality that produce or exacerbate the symptoms of mental illness. This is, of course, something that cognitive behavioral therapists argue quite a lot. I have the book by Richard Stott and his colleagues on my slide here, who argue that metaphors can be extremely effective because they tend to be so memorable. They can help a person to quickly adopt new ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, and they can help to bring about changes in our worldview and in our habits, which can then often be therapeutically helpful. For example, many writers with eating disorders report on the harmful ways in which they used to think about food and eating. They frequently talk about how they used to see food as nothing but calories. And of course, calories are an energy unit that across the West has taken on deeply negative connotations, often under the influence of the dieting culture, health and beauty industry, I think. And calories are now generally understood mostly in terms of their relation to body weight and fat instead of their relation to energy. So oftentimes, especially, or this is something that the writers in my corpus often talk about, at least, that when they were younger, when they were still sort of in the midst of their eating disorder, a plate of food would often look like a plate of disgusting fat-producing calories to them, or they perceived it in that way anyway, which then contributed to their fear of eating and their food avoidance. And as these cognitive behavioral therapists would argue, strategically and consciously transforming such harmful ways of understanding eating is key to eating disorder recovery. And we can see this reflected in the life writing as well. So I have another example here from my corpus. This is Lena S., who writes in her anorexia memoir, we chat this time about feeling cold, and he says something that I can no longer dismiss because it strikes a chord with me, something that will help me with my eating for years to come. Calories are warmth. So she's inspired by her friend here, who she's talking to and quoting here. And the writer uses this utterance of her friend as inspiration to begin metaphorically understanding calories as much needed warmth and as much needed body heat. This metaphor points towards the original meaning of calories as an energy unit, which is defined as the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature a certain amount of liquid by water, in fact, by 1 degree Celsius. And that takes away the focus from body weight and fat and places it on physical energy and body temperature instead. This kind of refocusing helped the author in cultivating a different attitude towards food, and she began seeing it as something that is beneficial rather than harmful, something that protects her against the constant cold she feels due to her significantly low weight. I know that seems like a relatively small, or that might seem like a relatively small, I don't know, act of new understanding to some of you, but from what I'm seeing in my corpus and also from what I know from talking to people who treat eating disorders, I know that such new ways of understanding eating and new ways of seeing food can actually have quite big or significant impacts on nutritional recovery. I want to close my part of this webinar with a final example of what metaphors can do for people with disordered eating. In most eating disorder memoirs that I've seen, we find a few particularly extended and creative metaphors that provide structure and logic for what I call the explanatory model created by the author. What I mean by explanatory model is that most writers of eating disorder memoirs feel the need to come up with an answer to the why me question. They seem to feel the need to come up with an explanation for why they were the ones that developed this mental illness. So they are thinking a lot about the origins and causes of their illness. And this is something that can be very beneficial for your well-being, at least according to psychotherapist Arthur Kleinman, whose book, The Illness Narratives, I have on my slide here. He argues that it is very beneficial to develop such an explanatory model in coping with illness because it can provide you with a sense of coherence. It provides you, or it endows your illness with felt meaning and purpose, and that can then generate positive emotions and positive attitudes towards the self. And in my research, I found that this seems to be true, at least according to the writers of eating disorder memoirs, who often build their explanatory models around extended metaphors. And I have another example of this on my slide here. In her bulimia memoir, Annika Fechner writes, and I quote, "Imagine you are blindfolded on a tightrope with only a balancing pole in your hands. You're happy and grateful that you have it and that you have learned to use it so well. Then someone shouts up to you from below, throw that fucking pole away. Nothing will happen to you. There's a net down here." In this metaphor, the author's illness is understood as a tool that served a protective purpose for a while. It served a protective purpose in a situation that she experienced as dangerous and volatile, and that situation was her childhood. So she imagines her childhood as a blindfolded tightrope walk and her eating disorder as a balancing pole that helped her stay upright and kept her safe from falling. That means her illness is here understood as a coping mechanism that met some of her younger self's needs and gave her a sense of protection, structure, and emotional balance, at least at first, before the harmful consequences of her bulimia started to outweigh the psychological benefits. And as she reports it in her memoir, this mapping then helped the author to find a reason for and an acceptance of why she became ill or why she was the one to develop bulimia. And this then helps her to counteract any harmful feelings of feeling guilty or of blaming herself that she experienced under the influence of the stigma surrounding her mental illness. And what is also useful about this metaphorical scenario is that she uses it to describe treatment and recovery as someone shouting at her to throw away the life-saving balancing pole of her illness. This makes it easier for the author to explain why recovery was so difficult to her or for her, and it also makes it easier for her to explain why she relapsed several times. And she can then cultivate a therapeutically helpful attitude of self-compassion and self-acceptance and generally more positive self-regard. And finally, I think this kind of explanatory model is also useful for her recovery because it charts a way forward and maps out a simple goal to work towards for the author in her recovery. Her recovery process becomes about finding a less harmful kind of balancing pole that can help her stay upright and moving forward. It becomes about finding a helpful habit, a resource, or a skill that can eventually replace her disordered eating in regulating her emotions and in establishing a more secure sense of self. And that leads me to my conclusion. I hope I'm good with my timekeeping. Please stop me if I'm going on for too long. I certainly couldn't go into that much detail today. I hope I was able to give you at least some insight into the potential effects and functions that metaphors could serve in writing about disordered eating. I wanted to show you that there's certain kinds of writing and certain kinds of metaphor that are particularly helpful, or at least that a lot of people seem to find particularly helpful. But I also wanted to be very clear that I'm not arguing that just because you start using a particular metaphor in your writing or your speech that you will be promptly healed. We all know that there's no magic bullets in mental health, but I do believe that metaphor use significantly influences how someone experiences the reality of their embodiment, how they experience their relationship with food, how they experience their relationship with their illness and its symptoms and themselves as an ill person. And all of that is definitely linked to well-being in various ways. We have seen that metaphors can externalize, explain, and justify mental illness, which may help a person gain illness insight and strengthen their intrinsic motivation to recover. We've also seen that metaphors can counteract harmful beliefs about food, and they can also help to combat painful emotions like self-blame and shame. And they can even at times help to foster more positive mental states like self-compassion and self-acceptance, which are generally useful in recovery. I think what I think makes metaphoric ways of thinking ways of understanding so effective is that they usually draw on something concrete and physical. They usually draw on things like animals, such as parasites, or certain objects like balancing poles, to make something as abstract and complex as a mental illness easier to understand, easier to talk about. And if we know one thing for certain, then it is that recovery from any mental health problem relies on expressing yourself and sharing your experience with someone else. It relies on reaching out for the support you deserve. And that's it from my end. Thank you so much for listening. I'm handing over to someone who knows a lot more knows a lot more than me about self-expression. So Molly, over to you. But I think Harriet, you also wanted to introduce Molly first. So actually over to Harriet.
It's so interesting. I've so many thoughts about everything that you've said. At the moment, I'm trying to finish a collection of short stories about eating disorders, but the first one I've called Monster, and it's from the eating disorders perspective. How it finds its victim. Um, and you're right, it's so helpful to try and communicate that idea that a person doesn't choose to have an eating disorder, that it's not a choice in that way. And also the way in which the eating disorder lodges in the person's head, and the insidious nature, and how it warps and distorts and controls and abuses and punishes and tortures and all of that. Yeah, it's so helpful. Thank you. That was so interesting. I would love to hear some more. But now I'm going to hand over to Molly Twomey. So Molly Twomey's debut poetry collection, Raised Among Vultures, was published in 2022 by the Gallery Press and won the Southward Debut Collection Poetry Award. It explores recovery from an eating disorder, and in her review for Poetry's Ireland's Trumpet, Annie Brown described it as feeling like a friend. Twomey's second collection, Chic to be Sad, supported by an Arts Council literary bursary, was published in 2025, also by the Gallery Press. And Molly, we're delighted to have you today. Thank you so much for being part of all of this. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Harriet, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm so happy to be here. And what I'm going to do is just chat a bit about how I came to be a writer, and what writing has done for me in recovery. So I'm just going to share my own slides. Yeah, so my name is Molly. I was diagnosed with an eating disorder in about 2016. And I'm a poet, and I have two collections of poetry, Raised Among Vultures and Chic to be Sad. And I'm just going to chat about how, yes, as I said, that writing has helped me in my recovery, but also I'm aware that, writing isn't therapy, and my process in recovery has also been alongside dietitians and therapists and psychiatrists, as well as the support of my loved ones. But I have found writing to be a really great tool. So my story with writing began in NUI Galway, where I wanted to write fiction, but I was really bad at it, and it wasn't working out. And I suppose at the same time, I was struggling with an eating disorder. I was really lonely. I had moved away from my friends and my family, my secondary school boyfriend, and it was all really scary. And I didn't know how to talk about it, or I didn't know how to process my emotions. And I ended up in a poetry class, reluctantly, with Kevin Higgins, who's this guy here, who's since passed away. But Kevin really encouraged us to write what we thought and what we were feeling, and to use our own voices. And so I did, and it was a great release for me. At the time, I don't think I knew how much I was struggling, but it was perhaps the first time that I was able to be kind of honest about some things. And one of the first poems I wrote in that class, I was very lucky. It ended up being published in the Irish Times subsequently, but it was a poem called Eat Yourself Beautiful. And it was a poem that was really angry. It was a really angry poem. It was really angry at nutritionists and kind of influencer culture that promotes disordered eating. And just kind of my rage at that whole scenario, and how, I knew that it was harming me and harming others, but I couldn't stop obsessing over it all, and following, their rules essentially. I don't particularly love that poem now, and I look back at it because it's written from this place of rage. But I suppose it was this place where I could finally kind of express that rage, and not, have someone tell me what to do over it or whatever. It was just kind of this freedom space. Yeah, so I still remain mad at nutritionists and influencer culture. But I do think a lot of those people are victims themselves, maybe, of diet culture and capitalism and body shame. But really, this was kind of the first place where I was able to express something, about what I was going through, and it came out in rage. So then I dropped out of NUIG because I was not doing well, and I went into treatment in Lost Bridges for a bit. And before I went into treatment, my mom had slipped a collection of poetry called "Waiting for My Clothes" by Leanne O'Sullivan into my bag, because I suppose she knew that I was struggling and that we hadn't really talked about it. But this collection, was about Leanne O'Sullivan's own struggle. And so I read that book, and it was probably the first time that I'd read about someone else who was going through or who had went through something similar to what I was going through. And I suppose it kind of encouraged me to start writing a bit more about my own experiences. These poems that I wrote, though, in treatment or during treatment, were all really angry poems. They were all poems of frustration, and rage, and very seldomly, but sometimes, there would be poems that were hopeful, that were about the future, that were thinking about what could the future be like. And now, when I kind of look back, or I think back about that time, I think those poems of hope were really, that it was my own voice coming through. They were these awful, ragey little eating disorder poems, but every now and again, my own voice would quietly come through in the poems, which was really great. And I think as well, nowadays we're so cautious, especially in a place like an eating disorder center. You're so cautious of not triggering other people with what's going on for you. So a notebook is a really great place to just kind of get everything out, and just, dump everything down without harming other people around you, but you're still kind of getting yourself that release. You're still kind of emptying your brain of what's really addling it, or what's really causing it pain. So I wrote every day in treatment. It was my way of coping, and it was my friend. I didn't have a whole lot of friends at this time, so it was, reading and writing were my friends. And I loved other people who had been through eating disorders. I loved their work. I loved this idea that you could come through it all, and that you could write about it. And writing was a kind of sense of closure for some people. I was obsessed with Leanne Sullivan, of course, and then like Louise O'Neill. They just were these kind of images of hope for me, that there could be a life after everything. So then I came out of treatment. I trained to be a yoga teacher, just as a side quest, when I didn't know what to do with myself. And then I went and transferred to double English in UCC. And so that's where I met Leanne O'Sullivan, whose book I was talking about previously. She ended up being my teacher in UCC, which was amazing. So in my undergrad, she would have taught me creative writing. So she was just so important for me, because it was like, here is this person who had been through an eating disorder, and who now, was a full-time poet who was living this really full life. And she was so fun and kind and relatable. And it was like, oh my God, like, life could be so much better, so just I was just obsessed with Leanne, and I ended up doing my dissertation on her, and it was just I was so lucky to have her. So I was really obsessed with Waiting for My Clothes, Leanne's first book, but then I think looking back on it, I actually got more out of her second collection, which is Kyloch, the Hag of Beara. And these were these poems that were really sensory, and the Kyloch is this mythical creature from Beara, and she's a petrified rock, but she's a petrified stone in the landscape. But there's so much stories about her in mythology, about her full non-conventional life, and Leanne's poems were really like sensory and about falling in love and having rage and having vulnerability, and they were really about living like a full life. And so I actually got more in terms of recovery out of Leanne's second book, because it was like, look what life could be like, look how full life could be. And Leanne would have encouraged a lot of us to write about mythology. And so I would have taken on more persona poems. So now I was imagining life in a different mindset. I was imagining, like, what if I was really fierce and bold, and what if I fell in love with someone, and what if so it was all kind of the power of imagination and coming out of your own head and your own self, and thinking bigger. And so opening up possibilities. And that was, mythology was actually so important for me at that time. Yeah, so and then I graduated from my master's, and of course went into a job in a hotel, because there's not many jobs for writers. But that was fine. And so it was tough enough, because I was trying to recover, trying to work full time, trying to write. And it was, yeah, I got through it. And then I was lucky to get an Arts Council bursary, which allowed me to quit work and to focus on my first collection, which was Raised Among Vultures, which I was so grateful for, because then I could really sit down, and I did so. And I finished my first book at my grandmother's house in Abbeyside. And Raised Among Vultures really is me kind of reflecting on my recovery, reflecting on my loved ones, everything that had happened. Yeah, and my experiences, thinking about my relationship to my body and what I had come through, and also what I was still going through, because I wrote Raised Among Vultures while I was still actively in recovery. And I used to go to this writing group called the Writer Salon, which it happens 3 times. In case anyone's interested, it happened anyway when I was doing it 3 times a day, where you could go onto a Zoom and kind of collectively write for an hour. So you're with a big group of people from all over the world. You come in and you say your intention, and then you write silently, and then it ends and you say maybe how you got on. And I found that really helpful, because as you all know, like, writing can be really isolating, particularly when you're writing about something that's kind of tough for you to talk about, or it's really heavy. It's really nice just to feel like you're not alone. So that was really great. Yeah, I had a really great time writing the first book, even though it was obviously really hard. I do think that the fact that I was able to sit down and think so deeply about everything that had happened, as Jakob was saying, kind of gave me this cohesive sense of kind of like why things happened, or trying to understand myself, and hopefully to become more empathetic towards myself, to not self-blame and guilt, and everything that comes with that. Yeah. And then well, after publishing Raised Among Vultures, I had so many amazing experiences, particularly with people who come up and chat to me about the collection, and maybe talk about their own experiences, or talk about someone that they loved who was going through, or had gone through something similar. And I find that experience to be really transformative. Opening up conversations, and making people feel safe, that they can talk about certain things, and that you might understand it more, or whatever, that sense of, we're always trying to work against stigmatizing eating disorders, and that sense that it's a kind of it happens, you know, so regularly, and that it's okay to talk about it, and that it's not dangerous, or it's not you know, that you could talk to me about it. I'm not going to be overwhelmed about it, essentially, is what I'm saying. But perhaps the best thing that happened to me, or one of the best things that happened to me after Raised Among Vultures, was that Poetry Unbound, which is a podcast, took one of my poems called The Drop Off, and they went through it. So Pádraig Ó Tuama runs Poetry Unbound, and I just wanted to bring it up because I think it's a really good resource if you are interested in poetry, and if you're interested in what poetry can do for you and how it can help you to reflect on your life, and even to live a little bit more deeply. And you know, I just think such a good podcast. So he reads the poem, and then he talks a lot about what's going on in the poem. He often will reflect on his own life and experiences, and then he comes back and he reads the poem again. So you kind of have the poem in a new way. You understand more of it. And so I just really wanted to flag that, because it's for me in recovery. It was often it's still in recovery, but it is often rituals, like having those little rituals that you do every day that kind of ground you and settle you and calm your nerves. And Poetry Unbound was definitely remains to be one of those rituals for me that's really helpful. So then I recently published Chic to be Sad, which is my second poetry collection, but it still has details about my recovery, because I'm still in recovery, even though it's been, you know, so many years. But that's totally fine. It still remains, poetry is still, you know, a best friend, I would say, in terms of helping me to deal with things, to cope with things, to figure things out, to sit down and wrangle with emotions, with change in particular, and you know, trying always to use the writing. It's the biggest coping mechanism that I have for dealing with emotions and transition and change. And honestly, I think writing saved my life. I really believe that. Like, it has gotten me through so much. So I can't state enough how much of a powerful tool it has been for me. Um, so I'm just so grateful for it. And now where I am at in my life is that I have also, like Jakob, decided to start a PhD, which is very scary, but we'll be fine. And so PhD will be on, again, writing poetry and thinking about eating disorders, because I just always it always comes back to that for me, because I really care about people with eating disorders, and I really care that more people know about it in a non-stigmatized, non-sensationalist way. Um, yeah, and so the last thing that I just we are having this lovely webinar to also talk about these workshops that me and Jakob will be running, called My Future Self. And so they're going to be online poetry workshops for people in recovery from disordered eating on November 1st and November 15th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And it's for over 18s only. And that's the email poetry dot de.2025@gmail.com if you do want to sign up. And I'm not sure if I should have shown the poster at this stage, but I've gone for it. So I hope that's okay. Yeah, and that's me and my story and all of my blabbing on. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Molly. And may I just add, the one bit of information about your workshops is that some of Jakob's funding is going towards them, so it's free to attend the workshops. Isn't that right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gosh,
That's right, yeah.
yeah. I feel inspired now after listening to you. I'm sure everybody here does. It's so powerful to think of writing functioning like that for you. Um, I think it absolutely can. And yeah, Yeah, I really feel inspired after listening to you. So thank you so much. And thank you, Jakob, as well. We have a couple of minutes for questions. I don't think there's any questions so far in the chat. Somebody very kindly posted the link to the poetry episode, to Poetry Unbound episode with your poem. Thank you very much for doing that. So if anyone has any question, you can pop it in the chat. We did put everyone on mute because there were lots of people registered for the webinar. But if you want to even put up your hand, I can unmute you if you want to ask a question. If anyone has a question. There you go.
Okay, thanks. Hello, and thanks so much for the webinar. That was fascinating and really gratifying to read, because I think sometimes for people in recovery with eating disorders, there can be a little bit of stigma around feeling like you need to connect with other people's stories. Like, I know sometimes I've kind of had like questioned whether it's like a kind of perpetuating the illness or kind of like normalizing it, or there's that urge to like learn how to do it better, unfortunately.
Mm.
So I kind of wonder like if that came up for either of you, or if you have any thoughts on that. Um, and then maybe like Jakob as well, if you have time to talk a little bit about. I remember reading Kelsey Osgood, what? Kelsey Osgood's book. And
Yeah.
I thought it was so fascinating. She was the first person that I read who really like framed her own kind of experience of becoming anorexic in terms of like the context of having read other people's memoirs. And I remember her talking a little bit, I think, about the fact that she felt like she wasn't authentic kind of as a person with anorexia because she had kind of deliberately and consciously decided to go down the road, something like that. So I don't know, just thoughts on maybe like choice, agency, how that translates into writing, maybe, and ideas around stigma.
Thank you so much for the question. Molly, shall I go first or do you want to go
Yeah,
first?
no, go for it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It is a really thorny topic in writing about your disordered eating, because, yeah, I think Kelsey Osgood, you're right, was one of the first ones to really address that issue, at least outside of academic circles. And I think since a lot of people have been inspired now by her memoir and they're doing similar things. So it is, you end up having to censor yourself a little bit because you can't actually then fully authentically express how you were thinking at the time because you don't want people to be inspired by that kind of thinking and by that kind of feeling. So I think it is a really tricky thing to balance, like thinking about your readers and thinking about your own authenticity. And and I think, so what I've heard, I don't know if you've ever heard about Emily Troscianko. I had her on my slide earlier. She's an eating disorder researcher and also has written a memoir about her own anorexia experience. And she's very interested in this topic. She's actually published a couple of papers about having done certain survey studies about people's experiences of reading eating disorders and how far it harmfully impacted them. And when she published her own memoir, she actually tested it on a group of like 60 readers with eating problems to make sure that it was safe for people to read when they had eating problems. So she went an extra step. So she first of all changed the way she was talking about her experience, but she also even did like a focus group, I guess, in advance of publication. And she's talked a lot about the fact that she usually writes two texts. She writes one text for herself in which she's just completely authentic and honest and just writes down whatever thoughts she has. But as soon as you want to publish what you're writing, you do have that, or she feels like you have that ethical duty to make your writing as safe as it can be. Obviously, you can never keep everyone safe, but like she's talked a lot about having to juggle these two things as well. And I think it is a really tricky thing to juggle. I even find that in talking about my research, there's so many things that I can't really quote in public because they wouldn't be great for people that struggle with disordered eating. But yeah, it's a really interesting issue. I don't have much more to say about it, but if you're interested in that topic, I can really recommend looking her up, Troscianko. She's published both essays about her writing process and then also just studies on exactly what you were talking about, the sort of feedback loop between writing and disordered eating, and reading and disordered eating, and how infectious it can be reading about other people's experiences. So she's thought a lot about that. Thank you.
Yeah, like I certainly was always in the back of my mind, and I think it's always like trying to be, trying to have as good intentions as possible. Definitely I read memoirs at the start of my recovery that were not helpful and that kept me in dark places. And that was tough, and I certainly don't want to do that to other people. So I think it's really challenging. And basically it's kind of that line of I don't want to do that to other people, but I also want to, as Jakob was saying, like be authentic and in poetry we talk a lot about truth. We talk about truth doesn't have to mean fact. It's often a feeling, and trying to get across this is how I felt at a time rather than this is what I did and this is how I looked and whatever. Yeah, it's like, and I'm grateful for organizations like Bodywhys that bring so much attention to sensationalist language and how that can be so harmful. Yeah, but God, we have actually got, I'm also so grateful we've come so far. Like when you think about how bad it was so bad. And it is improving so much, and I think it'll continue to evolve and improve, as well as all we can all do is continue to learn, and try to be more aware and careful.
Okay. Yes, I put a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry.
I'm wondering about, it seems like there are more women who are dealing with eating disorders than men. And I'm wondering if this is the case, and if so, what sort of psychological and sociological reasons are there for that? Because all the examples here have been women, I believe. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for that question, Glenda. Shall I go ahead, Molly, or do you want to go
Yeah,
first?
no, that feels like something you know more about than me.
I'm always hesitant to say that it is more women dealing with disordered eating than men, just because we know that a lot of men don't seek treatment. So when we look at the numbers of diagnosed cases, then it is for anorexia, for example, there's I think 4 times as many women, or even sometimes 5 times as many women dealing with anorexia than men, at least when we look at the diagnosed cases. But I think the sort of dark figure is much bigger than that, and it's only something that we've started to look at more recently. And then when we look at community-based samples, where we take a sample from a community and ask them about disordered eating experiences, then we see the numbers of men struggling with this issue go up quite a lot. They just don't, as I said, they don't seek treatment for it. And there's also quite male-specific eating disorders that are now being researched. There's something called muscle dysmorphia disorder, or that affects men more strongly than women, apparently, where it's more about this sort of muscular body ideal, but that still then leads to quite harmful disordered eating practices, and comes with really massive body image issues as well that are quite painful. Why that is the case, why there is a gender imbalance, I feel like, there are so many reasons for that. But of course, one of them is beauty ideals. Beauty ideals for women in most Western countries still emphasize, thinness and quite extreme thinness. And it's not the same for men yet, although we're going there. What is happening for men is that muscularity is more and more emphasized, which then leads to the emergence of new eating disorders. I think beauty ideals are a huge issue. The beauty and health industry is a huge issue, which seems to affect or target women more significantly. The fashion industry is an issue. So there's so many different factors working together there. But maybe, Molly, you have more to say on this topic, because I know that your PhD research will address some sociocultural issues around eating disorders as well.
Yeah, I'm also kind of interested in, the idea, if we perpetuate the idea that an eating disorder is something that affects women, then, less and less men are going to seek treatment and they're going to feel like, well, I'm not supposed to have this and because this is for women or whatever. So and I can totally see how you know, you can see it. You can see, yeah, particularly, I'm deeply interested in gym culture and men feeling pressured to look a certain way. I'm not sure that the beauty industry has at all gotten better for women. I think it's just gotten worse for men, and so level the playing field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Great.
do know that cases are rising of men also being diagnosed with eating disorders. So either it's more men also developing eating disorders or more men actually seeking treatment for it, but it is starting to level out a little bit. But yeah, I think it's still quite a big imbalance.
Mm.
Okay. Fitzy, did you want to say something there?
Yes. Oh yeah, thanks. I wasn't sure why I was on there. I was thinking as well as the beauty ideals. I think there is culturally an expectation on women to be able to like monitor and deny their needs as opposed to express them. And I think there's a feedback loop then in society where socially we're kind of conditioned to maybe not listen to women and not let them have as much space or speak the truth about what they need or what they feel they need. So that's probably in it, not just in terms of like the beauty ideals. And then I wonder as well if it's a little bit like the kinds of stories that are popularly told. Like there is that kind of narrative of like suffering, self-punishment, redemption arc that happens, and that's like a comfortable story for maybe if society has a kind of like repressed guilt about the shit deal that women are given. And that's kind of like a little happy story to tell. Might be part of it. But I also was thinking about like the Molly, when you talked about Leanne O'Sullivan's poetry, and there's another poet as well. I think it's Victoria something who wrote like Eat or We Both Starve.
Kind of thick, yeah.
Yeah, kind of like, yeah. And like other poets that I've read that have written about their experience of anorexia and the way we are like I do feel really lucky in Ireland that there are people like yourself and Leanne O'Sullivan and those writers that are able to articulate also the things behind the eating disorder, like relationships with family and like finding your place in society, and even this mysterious and fascinating process of like recognizing your own voice. Like when I was taking notes listening, I was thinking like, yeah, that's still a mystery to me, the whole idea of like, how do you know that that's your voice? Like, I feel like I have a million different voices. And yeah, I don't know, just a reflection.
And so thinking about that, maybe you might just say a little bit about how you're going to structure the workshops before we finish up. We've a couple of minutes, maybe.
Molly, do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, so I've selected a few poems that are kind of focused on the future and on hope and on your relationship with yourself and your hopes for yourself. And there are so a few poems that we'll read and we'll chat about the poems and then we'll work on a few writing prompts to get you writing your own poems. And it's hopefully going to be an encouraging and positive space. Yes.
Great. And so the two workshops are kind of linked then, are they? But
Yeah, so they're kind of a run on together. So hopefully people can come to both.
okay.
Yeah, our idea was that people would, after the first session, produce some writing on their own in sort of in preparation for the next session, and then we talk about that, the sort of the homework in the second session. So ideally, people would be able to attend both sessions, but if you can only attend one, I think we'll also be able to work around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in terms of numbers, have you thought about numbers of people attending the workshops?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. I'm trying to remember now. What did we say again?
I think we decided that around like a maximum of 15
Yes.
people would be
Yeah.
good, because otherwise it gets it's hard then to talk about individual pieces of writing if it's much more than that, especially on Zoom, I find. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, just send us an email if you're interested, and I'll send you the information on how to sign up and everything.
Great. Okay. And I think Ellen has put the email into the chat. And also we'll be posting it on our socials as well. And this webinar is recorded, so people can look back and have a think as well. So I just want to thank Molly and thank Jakob for coming today and talking to us about their great research and thinking behind this. And it's a real pleasure for us to be able to facilitate these workshops for you both. So thank you so much, and we hope they go really, really well for you.
Thank you.
Thank-
Thank you so much, Harriet. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much to everyone that came out today and listened to us. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, it was fab. Thank you.